You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cyberwire's Research Saturday. I'm Dave Bittner, and this is our weekly conversation with researchers and analysts tracking down the threats and vulnerabilities, solving some of the hard problems, and protecting ourselves in a rapidly evolving cyberspace. Thanks for joining us.
And actually, recently we observed a resurgence of this JDY botnet, and it's expanded in a couple of different ways. And that's really what prompted us to start digging into it again and, put out the research that is the subject of this blog.
That's Ian Golden, Senior Lead Information Security Engineer, along with Mike Horka, Principal Information Security Engineer from Lumen's Black Lotus Labs. They'll both be discussing their research entitled Expanded JDY IoT and Soho Botnet Enables Rapid Vulnerability Exploitation.
So this story goes back a couple of years. It involves Chinese APTs and cyber espionage. So it's actually not a new network. A few years ago, we published some research on another network called the KV botnet. And the KV botnet was important because it was linked to Volt Typhoon, which is, of course, the infamous Chinese APT responsible for targeting critical infrastructure providers. And at the time, the KV botnet was used as a covert network. And you'll hear this term sometimes also referred to as an orb network or operational relay box network. But they're basically groups of devices, sometimes compromised devices, that adversaries use to relay and proxy their traffic to obfuscate who they are, where they're coming from, and basically it helps them blend in with normal traffic. And so when we were doing our research on the KV botnet, we noticed it had kind of two main clusters. There was the KV side, which was sort of a covert data transfer network. And then the other side was, we called it the JDY cluster, and it was used for reconnaissance and targeting. The KV side of the network was disrupted by a law enforcement takedown a couple of years ago and has been pretty defunct since then. But the JDY side, the reconnaissance part, has never gone away. And actually, recently we observed a resurgence of this JDY botnet, and it's expanded in a couple of different ways. And that's really what prompted us to start digging into it again and, put out the research that is the subject of this blog.
Michael, I'm curious, when did you all realize that this wasn't just a botnet that had survived those earlier takedowns, but one that had actually grown into something a bit more capable?
Initially it was definitely size. The botnet or the JDY cluster that we were tracking during the days of KV botnet was more, I would call it more small scale. I think the peak that we would see was maybe 750, 800 bots or infected nodes that were checking into that cluster. But more recently, that had at least doubled, and we were seeing an increase in scanning activity and probing activity coming out of that cluster.
One of the things that struck me when I was going through the research was how much diversity there is in the compromised devices. Why would the threat actor expand beyond just a few router models to all these different SOHO and IoT devices? Ian?
Yeah, I think the short answer is that it makes it harder to track and block these devices. So like you said, initially years ago, it was basically two Cisco router models that they were using. And more recently, it's essentially doubled in size. There are now more than 1,500 compromised bots that are part of this network. And in addition to the increase in size, we're also seeing a diversification of device types, like you mentioned. So we're seeing other vendors being exploited, like Ubiquiti, Hikvision, Linksys, kind of the typical SOHO and IoT device types that you often see in botnets. And the reason that the advantage that gives the threat actors is essentially, it's scale plus diversity. It makes it harder to detect and block. It gives them more options. It helps them blend in with different kinds of traffic, and it makes it harder to take down. If there is another law enforcement takedown effort, it just gives them more places to hide.
Michael, the research describes JDY primarily as a reconnaissance platform rather than an exploitation platform. Can you help us understand the difference there and why reconnaissance is valuable for an advanced threat actor?
Yeah, absolutely. So we track JDY more generally as a scalable reconnaissance botnet. Its primary purpose is not pure exploitation or data theft or launching DDoS attacks. That's very commonly understood for the botnet terminology. Instead, JDY's primary purpose was to identify exposed services, fingerprint devices and servers, and then rapidly locate vulnerable infrastructure. So this particular type of telemetry that they're able to gather is we would assess fed back into a backend like intelligence collection database where then multiple China Nexus threat actors can parse, query, and filter through this data to guide their follow-on malicious activity. So how is that useful? You can kind of think about JDY as being like the initial scout, and its job isn't necessarily to attack the target, but its job is to identify locked doors, open windows, and fingerprint them in a way to provide enough information when they come back to report back into this database. So then you've got follow-on malicious threat actors who can take that information and action it in some way.
Well, if I owned one of these infected routers, what would it be spending its time doing? And would I even notice?
In a distributed fashion, perhaps not. And that's part of the benefit to the operators of this botnet in expanding to 1,500 and more compromised devices is that you are spreading out that load across all of those devices. So as a home user with a home router that may be compromised, maybe initially when you're one of 50 or 100 bots in the network, you may notice a spike in your bandwidth, or an unresponsive home router on a regular basis. But when you've got this distributed across thousands of nodes, it's far less likely that you're even going to notice as a home user.
The research talks about how the malware doesn't just scan everything indiscriminately. It's pretty selective in what it's doing. Ian, what's the significance of that?
Yeah, that's really important. There's definitely intentional targeting, but it's also at scale. So, some of these nodes are scanning hundreds of thousands of target IP addresses at a time, but it's not indiscriminate. It's not scanning the entire internet. It's not a replacement for something like Census or Shodan, these websites that basically scan and index the internet. There was a pretty strong focus on organizations that seem to align with Chinese geopolitical interests. So, for example, organizations that are related to the military. And that kind of reinforces the idea that this is part of a broader intelligence collection and exploitation pipeline. The point that Mike made earlier about the difference between reconnaissance and exploitation is really critical. We think this is one piece of the puzzle. And so one of the really interesting things we saw was, so back in April, there was a new Fortinet vulnerability that was disclosed. I think it was a CVSS score of 9.8, so a critical vulnerability. And basically within hours of the disclosure of that CVE, we saw a significant spike of scanning from the JDY bots against Fortinet devices. So clearly the threat actor is monitoring for new vulnerabilities as they're released, and then essentially tasking this botnet to go out and look for vulnerable devices that might be, vulnerable to that CVE. So it's not random or indiscriminate. It's targeted in a couple different key ways, and again, that speaks to the fact or our assessment that this is one part of kind of this larger exploitation pipeline.
Does this suggest that reconnaissance has become kind of an industrialized process where, these vulnerabilities get identified and maybe queued up for follow-on operations really quickly? The research really highlights the speed of exploitation here.
Absolutely. I think one of the key takeaways for defenders, reconnaissance is happening continuously and exploitation is happening continuously, and they're happening at scale. And, of course, now with AI, they're happening faster than ever before. And that's really the difference that we're dealing with today, has the potential to give adversaries the upper hand. And so, defenders are just going to have to be faster. They're going to have to be faster at prioritizing and patching new vulnerabilities, especially for internet-facing devices. And when intrusions do happen, they're going to have to be faster at detecting them and responding to them. This is why we have concepts like zero trust and assume breach. If a single edge device is compromised, that really ideally should not result in the compromise of your entire network. It doesn't have to result in a data breach. Those core concepts are something that I think we have to get back to sort of brilliance in the basics to deal with this kind of problem.
We'll be right back. The research notes that many of these compromised devices are located in the United States. Michael, what's the significance of that in terms of making them easy or difficult to detect or block?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes it, like the geographical location of a lot of the bots in a lot of the botnets that we track, not just JDY. It's rarely by chance. A lot of times we will see that there will be larger numbers of nodes in regions that China has a strategic interest in targeting. We've seen that in previous botnets like Raptor Train. Raptor Train was a good example where we saw a more even-keeled distribution of US and Taiwan-based bots or nodes that were part of that botnet. And that was in direct alignment with the type of targeting we observed against US and Taiwanese entities out of that network. The same applies here with JDY. So, we obviously have a higher frequency of US-based bots, and it's very likely not a coincidence that we're seeing that align almost directly with the type of US-based targeting that we see for this probing and scanning activity.
Definitely. And, to add to Mike's point, one implication of that is it makes traditional IP-based defenses like geofencing a little bit less effective. So, some of your listeners might have controls that, you might block connections from IPs in countries like China or Russia. But in this case, a lot of the IP addresses are in the United States. And so they're not coming from China or Russia. They look like they're coming from, a residential IP space in Ohio or a mom and pop law firm in Texas. So it helps the threat actors blend into traditional or legitimate user traffic. It really highlights the need to move beyond those kind of traditional IP-based defenses, and you need to start incorporating, better cyber threat intelligence and sort of more behavioral controls.
Can we dig into that for just a second? I mean, what makes malicious reconnaissance from a home router look so much like legitimate traffic? Help me understand that strategy.
So one strategy that is pretty common in enterprise environments is you might block connections from known VPN providers or known data center IP addresses. You can distinguish pretty easily with IP enrichment between residential IP space and data center IP space. And I know that if a data center is scanning me, it's a little bit more suspicious because that's likely someone that has set up some sort of automated. They could be trying to brute force your VPN or scan your website. It sticks out a little bit more for the defenders. But when you have activity coming from residential IP space, it just makes it a little bit harder to filter out and to block.
I'm curious, from a technical point of view, was there anything outstanding or interesting in your analysis here? Anything that set this apart from things you'd seen before?
Purely from like a capabilities standpoint for what JDY was able to do, it had some pretty intense like multi-protocol. It was able to do banner grabs and service grabs, and then also fingerprint those. So it had follow-on filters that it was able to apply. So it was able to kind of ignore, generic filters or generic banner responses that it would receive, which is basically just it's a way of saying that they were able to do like fingerprinting plus on top of like a service that they're able to provide back to whoever is consuming their scan results on the back end. As part of their TLS certificate collection that they were doing, they were able to, consumers of this data would be able to identify domain names or specific targets, specific domains attached to those TLS certificates. And then you also had the vulnerability-driven probing that Ian already talked about, which is, this network was pivoting so quickly on recent vulnerabilities as they're announced. So again, from like a consumer standpoint of someone who would be looking through this data, they're getting, near real time, within hours of vulnerabilities being released, very specific, attributed and detailed results on, let's use the Fortinet vulnerability, for example, on all the Fortinet devices in very high profile sectors in the US, potentially within maybe 3 to 6 hours after a vulnerability is released. And that type of turnaround time, that speed, is probably one of the more concerning aspects of something like JDY. So speed and scale, we talked about the scale as well, but speed in particular, that turnaround time, but then scale on the fact that they're able to do this near surreptitiously because of the spread across thousands of Soho devices. They're able to feed back this data largely without being noticed.
Yeah, one of the things that caught my eye was you all highlighted the adaptability of the malware, that depending on the level of access that it had on a particular compromised device, it would behave differently. That struck me as being an interesting design choice. Can you explain that to us?
So one interesting aspect of this malware is that if it had root or admin privileges on the target device, then it was able to open up a raw socket, TCP socket, and create a custom TCP packet to allow the malware to launch SYN scans against its targets. And those SYN scans basically allow really rapid scanning, and it also prevents application level logging on the target end. And if it did not have root privileges, or if it was conducting a web scan, then it would just use the normal TCP stack to basically enumerate the services that Mike talked about. So grab things like TLS certificates and service banners and things like that.
Mike, anything else that caught your eye?
I guess just to add on to what Ian just said, another thing that benefits for the threat actors is the overall noise reduction and bandwidth limitations, or bypassing bandwidth limitations on home routers. It's obviously that's something we talked about, where would a home user notice if their bandwidth spiked because their home router is potentially scanning thousands or tens of thousands of servers out on the internet. And perhaps if they were doing full TCP handshakes, and hitting tens of thousands of nodes, but when they're doing pure SYN scanning, like Ian just described, where they could do it through the raw socket, that again just allows them to do it more scalably, but also remain extremely stealthy.
Looking at the big picture here, what is your sense? Is this the shape of things to come, where adversaries maintain these standing reconnaissance platforms so that they're always ready when the next vulnerability is announced? Ian?
Definitely. I think reconnaissance is becoming industrialized at scale, kind of like we talked about earlier. I think defenders, sometimes we tend to neglect reconnaissance. You often don't really hear about it in reading a threat intelligence report or an incident response report. You might not see very much on the recon side, but there's a reason why it's the first step in the cyber kill chain. You can't exploit a vulnerable device or service if you don't know it exists. And I think a lot of offensive security professionals, red teamers and pen testers would probably agree that reconnaissance is one of, if not the most important step in the process. And so there's a sort of asymmetry there. It's really important for attackers, but kind of neglected by defenders. And this research shows that it's becoming a sort of foundational part of, it was already a part of a foundational part of of sort of nation state level activity, but it's only becoming more so. And it's again becoming industrialized. It's happening at scale. It's happening faster and faster than ever before. So this is something that we might need to start paying a little bit more attention to.
Michael, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are definitely seeing industrialization and commercialization of network infrastructure across the board, I would say. I mean, we talk a lot about botnets, obfuscation networks. We've put out several blog posts on a few of those and discussed orb networks, proxy networks. All of those are, not all of them, but a good portion of them are servicing multiple malicious threat actors that are operating over them to enable their operations. And so you have JDY involved in that first step of the cyber kill chain, reconnaissance. You've also got, there's weaponization and delivery after that. And that starts leading into exploitation. And we're seeing that, just across the board for almost every step of the cyber kill chain at this point. We're seeing different aspects of it being industrialized through shared orb networks, commercialization, through shared scanning and probing results, fingerprinting databases. We're also seeing a lot of shared malware across threat actors. It kind of used to be that threat actors would maintain a tight hold on a lot of their custom malware, and you start seeing that more and more with the shared malware, or even just off the shelf tools that they can get freely available on GitHub that are being shared across the board. So there's absolutely just a full industrialization of a large portion of the cyber kill chain at this point that we're observing.
For the security folks in our audience, the people who are tasked with defending their own organizations, based on the research you all have put together here, what are your recommendations?
I think there are kind of two categories of recommendations. First, for listeners at home, or if you're in a small business, you want to make sure that your router doesn't end up compromised and a part of this botnet. So basic cyber hygiene is important. You want to make sure that you're not using old end-of-life routers or IoT devices, and make sure that they're updated and that you apply patches regularly and occasionally reboot those devices. And the second category is, for the larger organizations who might actually be targeted by the reconnaissance activity itself. I think the two main recommendations, the priorities are really to, one, reduce your external attack surface, anything exposed to the internet, as much as possible. And then two, you're going to have to establish a vulnerability program that prioritizes patching, especially for internet-facing devices. There are more recommendations in the CISA and UK government reports that we link to in our blog. A lot of them come down to kind of the foundational security controls that are often easier said than done. Things like hardening attack surface and securing credentials. Again, the sort of foundational zero trust type policies that we need to get better at to deal with some of these actors like Volt Typhoon, who are using living off the land techniques and leveraging these kinds of covert devices.
Our thanks to Ian Golden and Mike Horka of Lumen's Black Lotus Labs. We'll have a link to their research entitled Expanded JDY IoT and Soho Botnet Enables Rapid Vulnerability Exploitation in the show notes.
And that's Research Saturday, brought to you by N2K Cyberwire. We'd love to know what you think of this podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. If you like our show, please share a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. Please also fill out the survey in the show notes or send an email to cyberwire@n2k.com. This episode was produced by Liz Stokes. We're mixed by Elliot Peltzman and Trey Hester. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. Peter Kilpie is our publisher, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time.